I keep replaying the moment the email landed, not because I want to relive it, but because my mind refuses to let it settle. The subject line was neutral, polite, retention adjustments, confidential. Nothing about it suggested what it would take from me. I remember the exact posture I held in my chair, the way my shoulders were relaxed, the way my coffee had gone cold beside my keyboard. I remember thinking, very calmly, that this was finally the acknowledgement people like me wait years for. Not applause, not praise, just balance. When I opened it and saw the numbers, my body didn't react the way you'd expect. No spike of anger, no rush of heat, just a small internal click, like a mechanism disengaging. Ethan Miller, $75,000. My name, 25. I stared at the screen, and the first thought wasn't jealousy. It was confusion. I'd signed off on Ethan's first client deck. I'd corrected his emails before they embarrassed him. I'd sat in rooms where his voice shook and subtly stepped in so no one noticed. I didn't just mentor him, I buffered him from failure. Outwardly, I did nothing. I didn't swear, I didn't pace, I didn't send a message asking for clarification. I sat there, breathing evenly, telling myself this was an administrative error, that HR would fix it by morning, that numbers on a screen couldn't rewrite 12 years of contribution. Inside, though, something was folding in on itself, slowly, quietly, like paper being creased again and again until it can't lie flat anymore. What I didn't say was that the bonus wasn't the point. What I pretended not to notice was the message beneath it. Value had been reassigned. Future favor had been declared. I wasn't overlooked, I was deprioritized. There's a difference, and it matters. When I checked the internal compensation system and saw the breakdown, that difference became permanent. Growth alignment, strategic retention, words designed to sound forward-facing while quietly erasing people who no longer fit the picture. The disturbing detail came later, buried in the metadata. A timestamp. The approval for Ethan's bonus had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, 2 days after I'd personally recommended him for expanded responsibility in a board review. My endorsement had triggered his elevation. Mine had already been capped. That meant the decision wasn't reactive, it wasn't comparative, it was premeditated. I'd helped sharpen the blade. At 4:37 a.m., the office was empty in a way that felt staged. London beyond the glass looked artificial, like a backdrop that had been switched off. I reread Sarah Whitmore's message again, slower this time. This decision aligns with the company's future vision. The word future lingered. I realized I had been moved into the past without being informed. My role, my trajectory, my relevance, all reassigned while I was still performing at full capacity. I placed my ID card on the desk with deliberate care. I logged out of systems I'd helped design. Each logout felt like a door closing behind me, not with a slam, but with a soft, final seal. There was no dramatic exit, because drama would have implied uncertainty. I didn't have any. What I felt instead was emotional numbness, so complete it bordered on clarity. When you lose something irreplaceable, status, identity, the story you tell yourself about your place in the world, there's a moment where pain hasn't caught up yet. That was the moment I was in. People later told each other I must have snapped, that I stormed out. The truth is less comfortable. I was calm because I was done negotiating with a system that had already decided I was expendable. Harrington and Cole didn't just misjudge my value, they misunderstood the architecture of their own stability. The clients who trusted me didn't do so because of a logo. They trusted me because I remembered details, because I absorbed risk quietly, because I never needed credit to deliver results. As I stepped into the elevator, I asked myself a question I'd never considered before. Not why did this happen, but what would happen next? What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? That question stayed with me as the doors closed, as the building receded, as 12 years compressed into a single decision that no one else had been awake to witness. By the time I reached the street, the shock had hardened into something colder. This hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't been budgetary. It hadn't been careless. It was a message delivered quietly, late at night, by people who assumed I would absorb it the way I always had, silently. Standing there, I understood the most dangerous truth of all. This hadn't been an accident. It had been planned. I didn't disappear after that night. That's what they assumed I would do. Fade out, sulk, take a few weeks, update my resume, quietly look for relevance somewhere else. Instead, I stayed just close enough to watch, close enough to listen, close enough to be underestimated. From the outside, Harrington and Co. looked relaxed, almost celebratory. Ethan's name started appearing more frequently in internal mentions, congratulatory messages, smiling emojis, casual praise framed as inevitability. He wore his new confidence like a tailored jacket, comfortable, a little too proud. He spoke more in meetings now, interrupted more. He had the tone of someone who believed the ground beneath him was solid. No one checked on me. That was the first gift they gave without realizing it. Silence creates space. Space creates access. I began my observation phase quietly, not lurking, not snooping, just paying attention the way I always had. I watched how emails were phrased when executives thought no one important was reading. I noticed how Sarah Whitmore relaxed her language when she assumed compliance. I listened to Ethan talk about long-term strategy without realizing how often he contradicted himself depending on who was in the room. Confidence, when it's new, leaks information. They underestimated my calm. They mistook it for resignation. My first move wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even visible. I reached out to 3 clients I'd personally onboarded years ago, not to pitch, not to warn, just to check in. A courtesy call, a familiar voice, no company branding, no agenda. I asked how things were going, what challenges they were seeing this quarter, what they wished consulting firms understood better. People tell you more when they don't feel sold to. One of them paused longer than expected, then said something small, something harmless on the surface. "We've noticed the tone has changed lately." Another mentioned delays. A third admitted they were considering a secondary advisor just in case. None of this was a crisis, not yet, but it was a hairline fracture, and hairline fractures spread. The mini revenge came in the form of timing. I declined to intervene when a minor misunderstanding escalated into a scheduling issue, one I would normally have smoothed over instinctively. I let Ethan handle it. He did his best. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't me. The client felt the difference, not enough to complain, enough to remember. That was the win. Small, precise. It didn't explode, it pressed. The hidden weakness revealed itself a week later. Ethan needed affirmation, constantly. He relied on upward signals to calibrate his authority. Without feedback, he second-guessed. Without praise, he overcorrected. He filled silence with noise. That made him predictable, and predictability is a liability in rooms where perception matters more than truth. I stayed invisible. No LinkedIn updates, no announcements, no dramatic exit narrative, just quiet presence and selective absence. I knew which meetings to skip and which to quietly observe through forwarded notes. I knew which calls would be summarized inaccurately and which details would be omitted because they seemed non-essential. Those omissions accumulated. What they didn't know was that my relationships weren't transactional. They were layered, built over years of consistency. When people trust you, they tell you when they're uneasy. When they're uneasy, they start planning contingencies. And when contingencies start forming, loyalty shifts without anyone needing to declare it. I felt a strange detachment watching it happen. Not satisfaction, not joy, something closer to confirmation. Revenge, I was learning, doesn't feel like fire. It feels like alignment.
like pieces finally moving where they were always meant to go. There were moments I questioned myself, wondered if I should stop, if letting things correct themselves would be enough, but then I'd remember the timestamp, the approval date, the way my future had been quietly finalized without my knowledge. That memory kept me steady. They celebrated a minor quarterly win at the end of the month, drinks in the conference room, laughter echoing off glass walls. Ethan gave a short speech about momentum and vision. I watched from the edge, unnoticed, and realized something important. They thought the story had ended when I walked out at 3:47 a.m. I knew it had just started.
The ripples didn't announce themselves. They never do. They moved quietly, outward, touching things that seemed unrelated at first. A delayed approval here, a rescheduled call there. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarms, just enough to create friction. Friction makes people adjust. Adjustment reveals fear. Ethan adjusted first. I noticed it in the way his emails grew longer, more explanatory, as if volume could replace certainty. He began looping in extra people for visibility. He asked for confirmations that used to be assumed. In meetings, he smiled more, laughed a little too quickly, and spoke just a fraction louder than necessary. Confidence doesn't need witnesses. Anxiety does. Sarah Whitmore changed next. HR always senses pressure before leadership admits it exists. Her messages became careful, less declarative, more hedged. Phrases like subject to review and pending alignment started appearing where authority used to be implied. She scheduled check-ins that had no clear purpose. Those meetings ended with more questions than answers, which told me everything I needed to know. I stayed harmless, or at least I appeared to. I kept my tone neutral, helpful when asked, absent when not. I let them see exactly what they expected to see, a man quietly accepting his reduced relevance. There's a strange freedom in being underestimated. No one guards doors they believe you can't open. The consequences of the first move surfaced in small conversations. Clients asking for clarifications they'd never needed before. Internal teams rechecking assumptions that used to stand unquestioned. None of it pointed back to me. That was important. Revenge that announces itself invites resistance. I wasn't interested in resistance. I was interested in gravity. As the pressure grew, I noticed something else changing. Me. I was becoming more patient than I'd ever been, less reactive, less attached to outcome in the traditional sense. Revenge wasn't making me angrier, it was making me quieter, more precise. That realization unsettled me more than anything they were experiencing. I wondered what it said about a person when control feels more grounding than vindication. Then the time pressure arrived. A major cross-border deal, one I'd helped architect in its earliest phase, was approaching its final approval window. Regulatory scrutiny had increased. The margin for error was shrinking. Everyone knew the timeline was tight, but only a few people understood how tight. I understood it completely. I also knew where the vulnerabilities were buried, which assumptions had been carried forward without revalidation, which disclosures were technically compliant but contextually fragile. The viewer in my head, the one that keeps me honest, asked a question I couldn't ignore. How long could you pretend to be harmless if everything depended on it? The answer, it turned out, was longer than they could afford. Ethan started asking indirect questions, casual ones. You worked closely with this client early on, right? Do you remember how compliance interpreted that clause? He never asked directly for help. Pride wouldn't allow it. Fear wouldn't allow honesty. He was trying to triangulate reassurance without admitting he needed it. That hesitation cost him time. Paranoia crept in around the edges. I saw it when meeting agendas were revised last minute, when side conversations stopped abruptly as I entered a room, when decisions that should have been straightforward were escalated unnecessarily. Confusion is exhausting. Exhaustion leads to mistakes. I thought about walking away more than once.
about letting the system collapse under its own weight without my involvement. But then I remembered what had been taken from me wasn't just a role or a bonus. It was authorship over my own narrative. They'd written my ending without consultation. That wasn't something I could leave unaddressed. What they didn't know, what none of them suspected, was that I still had access. Not the kind that triggers alerts, not the kind that shows up in logs. Institutional memory. Context, documentation trails that only make sense if you know where to look and how pieces were originally intended to fit. I had copies of early frameworks, emails that clarified intent, notes from calls that were never formally summarized because they were deemed foundational. Individually, those things were harmless. Collectively, they formed a map that could guide a deal safely through scrutiny or expose exactly where it was most vulnerable. The pressure intensified as the deadline approached. Voices tightened, smiles thinned. Ethan began arriving early and staying late, as if proximity to effort could substitute for experience. Sarah requested a risk review she couldn't quite define. No one slept well. I slept fine. By then, the shift was undeniable. The calm had moved. It no longer belonged to them. I realized, standing alone one evening, that I wasn't reacting anymore. I was positioning. And the difference between those two states is the difference between survival and control. They were afraid of outcomes they couldn't see. I was holding something catastrophic.
The first visible cracks appeared in places no one expected to look. Not in financials, not in headcount, in reputation. A question raised during a compliance call that should have been routine, a pause where confidence used to live, a follow-up email from a regulator that was technically neutral but unmistakably alert. Nothing had exploded yet, but everyone could feel the pressure shifting from internal anxiety to external attention. I remained calm, deliberately so. Calm unnerves people when they're surrounded by motion. While leadership scrambled to prepare explanations, I watched patterns repeat themselves, the same assumptions being defended, the same shortcuts being justified as industry standard, the same names, Ethan's now prominent, attached to decisions that hadn't been stress-tested. Visibility, it turned out, cuts both ways. The first public consequence came when a client postponed a joint announcement. No reason given, just a polite delay pending further review. That single sentence did more damage than any accusation could have. Delay implies doubt. Doubt invites scrutiny. Scrutiny accelerates decay. Ethan confronted me 2 days later. Not openly, not aggressively. He caught me near the elevators and lowered his voice, as if volume itself might incriminate him. He asked if I'd noticed some tension lately, if I thought the deal was being misunderstood. The phrasing was careful. He was fishing for reassurance without offering vulnerability. I met his eyes, kept my expression neutral, and said I wasn't close enough to the current process to have an opinion. It was true, and it wasn't, both at once. I could see it land. The realization that I wasn't available the way I used to be, that access to my certainty was no longer automatic. He thanked me, forced a smile, and walked away slightly faster than he'd approached. Intimidation had failed because it had never truly been attempted. He didn't know how to threaten someone who had already left. What he didn't know, what none of them did, was that this moment had been years in the making, long before part 1, long before the email. I'd learned early at Harrington & Co. that power doesn't sit where org charts say it does. It sits in continuity, in memory, in the people who understand why things were built the way they were, not just how they function now. I'd kept my own records, not out of paranoia, out of habit, out of responsibility. Those records were now active. The revenge plan hadn't started with anger. It had started with preparation, with noticing how often decisions were justified verbally but documented ambiguously, how intent was explained in meetings but softened in writing. That gap, the space between what was said and what was recorded, was where inevitability lived. All it required was timing. As consequences stacked, leadership attempted to regain control through visibility. More meetings, more updates, more insistence on alignment.
But alignment can't be manufactured under pressure. It has to exist beforehand, and it didn't. Each attempt to assert authority revealed how fragmented things had become. I stayed out of the spotlight. When asked to contribute, I offered facts without interpretation, context without guidance, just enough to be useful, not enough to be responsible. Responsibility had already been reassigned to people who believed they were ready. The regulator scheduled a secondary review, still procedural, still calm, but now official. Sarah's voice shook slightly on the internal call announcing it. Ethan stopped interrupting in meetings. He started taking notes instead. That shift told me everything. People stop performing when they realize performance won't save them. One afternoon, as I watched the city from a conference room window, I understood the truth of what was happening. No one was steering anymore. They were reacting, and reaction is always too slow. The plan had crossed a threshold. The sequence couldn't be reversed, only completed. Too many documents had been requested, too many questions had been asked, too many assumptions had been locked into place under scrutiny. The damage wasn't coming. It had already arrived.
The tension became almost unbearable. Every day felt like walking a tightrope over a pit no one else could see. One misstep, one miscalculation, one moment of overconfidence from me or from them could undo everything. I felt the weight of 12 years of careful work pressing down, the responsibility for both my revenge and the consequences it unleashed. And yet I couldn't stop. Not now, not when the fracture lines had become visible, spreading faster than anyone realized. Ethan was showing cracks I hadn't predicted, though not in ways that satisfied me. He didn't break visibly, he didn't scream or lash out, he overcompensated. Spent hours rewriting reports, clarifying emails that hadn't needed clarification. He double-checked meeting notes. He apologized to clients for miscommunications that weren't his fault. Pride had become his own trap. And every small concession he made, every hesitant sentence reminded me that power is never recovered once quietly seated. Sarah, too, was unraveling, though with more subtlety. She tried to restore order with more check-ins, more carefully worded memos, more attempts at alignment. Each action revealed her uncertainty. Each attempt to cover gaps exposed another. And yet she remained unaware that I had anticipated every one of these moves, that every email and every request had been read with the knowledge of what it really implied and what it could trigger. The final test came in the form of a deadline I had helped set years earlier, a cross-border contract that was teetering on approval. If it went wrong, they would blame the person closest to the technical details. That person wasn't me, or at least it appeared that way. They didn't know I had positioned myself to watch without touching, to guide without revealing. Every minor friction point I had created through absence and subtle intervention now rippled outward. Confusion and fear spread faster than any positive effort could counteract. For a fleeting moment, I considered walking away, letting it all resolve itself naturally, letting the system collapse without my intervention. The thought of giving up felt seductive. To not carry the weight, to not orchestrate the final moves, to let karma or corporate ineptitude finish the work. But then I remembered what had been taken from me, my story, my identity, the narrative of my career. Letting them believe they had won after all that wasn't an option. The reversal came almost imperceptibly. One last email misstep by Ethan, a scheduling error, a misquoted clause was enough. I quietly forwarded context to the right clients, correcting the record without revealing the source. Within hours, a client questioned a key assumption Ethan had made publicly. Suddenly, his authority faltered. Meetings that had been smooth became tense. He tried to regain composure, but every step revealed insecurity. The map I had memorized, the gaps I had anticipated, had done exactly what it was designed to do. By the end of the week, both Ethan and Sarah realized, with growing dread, who had been orchestrating the subtle shifts. They didn't see my hand directly. They didn't see me intervene openly, but they saw the patterns too late. And recognizing patterns after the fact isn't empowerment, it's fear.
The emotional cost of revenge was undeniable. Every day I felt a tightness in my chest, a small nausea that reminded me I was no longer the person I had been at Harrington and Cole. Calmness had transformed into calculation. Patience had transformed into obsession. I recognized in myself someone I barely knew, someone willing to sit quietly while others unraveled, someone willing to watch opportunity slip away and act only when the timing was perfect. And yet, seeing them falter, seeing the first real acknowledgement of their vulnerability, I felt a grim satisfaction. Not joy, not triumph, just recognition. They finally understood in that cold, delayed way who had been directing the pressure, who had quietly rewritten the balance of authority. I asked myself the question that had haunted me since part 3. If winning meant becoming someone you no longer recognize, would you still finish? I did, because some things once taken can't be left unresolved, and some lessons once learned must be enforced. By the end of that week, the first acknowledgement arrived, not from HR, not from leadership, from the silence in Ethan's office, from the subtle hesitation in Sarah's emails, from the careful steps they now took around me. The invisible architect of their unraveling had been identified. They realized, finally, who had been dismantling the facade they believed was stable. And the story was far from over.
The collapse was quiet, almost imperceptible to anyone outside the inner circle. No shouting, no dramatic confrontations, just the slow, inexorable erosion of authority, confidence, and reputation. Ethan's carefully curated image, the one built on a mix of charisma and shallow competence, crumbled under the weight of mistakes that now seemed glaringly obvious. Contracts delayed, clients questioning assumptions, internal teams hedging their commitments, each minor misstep magnified because the foundation, his credibility, was quietly removed from beneath him. Sarah Whitmore's influence dissolved in parallel. Her attempts to assert control only drew attention to gaps she had assumed were invisible. Emails were forwarded, questions repeated, minor inconsistencies highlighted. She realized, too late, that my knowledge of the company's internal workings, the clients, the processes, and the intentions behind every decision had made me untouchable. Every action she took to fix things merely revealed her own vulnerability. I didn't need to celebrate. There was no fist pump, no victory lap. The inevitability of what had been set in motion was sufficient. Watching the dominoes fall, knowing precisely how far each one would travel, was the only satisfaction required. Years of preparation, observation, and patience culminated not in spectacle, but in certainty. I reflected on what I had lost along the way. 12 years of loyalty, relationships taken for granted by others, recognition that never came. My sense of stability, my personal narrative rewritten by someone else while I performed at full capacity. I had paid an emotional toll that few could comprehend. Revenge, even calculated and patient, extracts its own price. And yet I had reclaimed what mattered most: dignity, control over the story of my own life, the truth. Those clients, those contracts, that institutional memory, they remembered me, not the company, not the name on the building, me. The respect I had been denied was quietly returned, not through confrontation, but through inevitability. The final blow was as simple as it was devastating. Ethan Miller was no longer the rising star. He was the cautionary example. Sarah Whitmore no longer projected authority. Their names, once spoken with confidence, were now uttered with hesitation, and every glance that fell on me carried the unspoken acknowledgement. The quiet, patient, underestimated force they had dismissed had orchestrated their undoing. I walked away from the office for the last time with the same calm I had carried on the night I first left. There was no cheering, no celebration, just a deep, unshakable certainty that the long game had been won, that the power they thought they held had always been contingent, and the one they thought powerless had quietly orchestrated the collapse.
Some lessons are learned too late, some mistakes are irreversible, and some revenge is loudest not in action, but in absence. The loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.